I watched my father sign the papers that would send me to live with the Blackwood family, his pen scratching across the contract like nails on a chalkboard. At 17, I was being traded like livestock, my hand in marriage to their son Marcus, in exchange for a merger that would save Dad's failing tech company. The ink wasn't even dry when Marcus leaned over and whispered in my ear, "Don't worry, little bride. I'll break you in gently." His breath reeked of expensive whiskey and entitlement, and his fingers traced along my arm with possessive confidence. That's when the memories of my past life came flooding back like a dam bursting in my mind. I remembered dying at 25 in a car accident. No, not an accident. Marcus had tampered with my brakes after I'd threatened to leave him. I remembered the years of systematic abuse that had led up to that moment, the way he'd isolated me from everyone who might have helped, the careful psychological torture that had broken me down piece by piece. But most importantly, I remembered exactly how this entire empire of corruption operated, and I knew precisely when and how it would all come crashing down. The memories were crystal clear now, flooding back with terrifying detail. I could see every bruise Marcus had given me, remember every cruel word, every humiliation, every moment when I'd begged him to let me go home only to be reminded that I had no home to return to. My father had made sure of that when he'd signed this devil's bargain. But this time would be different. This time, I had knowledge. This time, I had power. This time, I would be the architect of their destruction instead of their victim. The path to this moment had been inevitable since my mother died when I was 12. Before her death, our family had been happy, or at least functional. Dad ran his tech startup with passionate determination. Mom worked as a pediatric nurse, and I was their academically gifted daughter who devoured books and dreamed of studying computer science at MIT. We had Sunday morning pancakes, family game nights, and a future that seemed bright and secure. Then Mom got sick. Ovarian cancer, stage 4 by the time they caught it. Dad spent every penny he had on treatments, experimental procedures, anything that might save her. I watched him age a decade and 6 months, saw the light go out of his eyes as each new treatment failed. When she died, she took something essential from both of us, but Dad never recovered the way I eventually did. He remarried within 6 months to a woman named Patricia, who came with her own daughter, Sophia, exactly my age. At the funeral, Patricia had played the role of sympathetic family friend perfectly, bringing casseroles and offering to help with household tasks. She'd positioned herself as a lifeline for a grieving man who couldn't figure out how to raise a teenage daughter alone. But the moment the wedding ring was on her finger, everything changed. Patricia wasn't evil in an obvious way. She was far too clever for that. Instead, she was a master of subtle manipulation, slowly rewriting the family dynamics until I became the outsider in my own home. It started with small things, suggesting that I was too old for Dad to keep babying me, pointing out how difficult I'd become since Mom's death, hinting that my grief was excessive and attention-seeking. Sophia, her daughter, was everything Patricia wanted me to believe I wasn't. Blonde, where I was brunette, outgoing, where I was bookish, effortlessly popular, where I struggled to maintain friendships after Mom's death. Patricia held her up as the perfect example of how a teenage girl should behave, and slowly but surely, Dad began to see me through that distorted lens. Within a year, the transformation was complete. Sophia got the bigger bedroom, my parents' old room, which Patricia claimed was more appropriate for a girl her age. I was moved to the basement, which Patricia decorated cheerfully and called my private space, but felt more like exile. Sophia got new clothes each season, while I was told to be grateful for hand-me-downs. When I asked about college funds, Patricia gently explained to Dad that perhaps resources should be focused on Sophia, who was more naturally academic, while I might be better suited for practical skills. The gaslighting was masterful. Anytime I complained or pushed back, Patricia would sigh sadly and explain to Dad how my anger issues were clearly a result of unresolved grief. She'd suggest therapy, but only the kind that focused on making me more compliant and family-oriented. She convinced him that my desire for independence was unhealthy, that my academic ambitions were unrealistic, that my resistance to their new family structure was a sign of psychological problems. Dad, drowning in his own grief and desperate for someone to take care of the daily details of life he could no longer handle, went along with everything. It was easier to believe Patricia's version of reality than to confront the possibility that he was failing his daughter. Easier to see me as the problem than to acknowledge that he'd brought a predator into our home. By the time I turned 15, I'd become a servant in my own house. While Sophia got tutors and music lessons, I cleaned bathrooms and did laundry. When Sophia crashed her car drunk at 16, they made me confess to the police to protect her driving record. When she plagiarized her way through high school, I was forced to do her homework to maintain her GPA, and threatened with homelessness if I refused. The worst part wasn't the labor or even the lies. It was watching my father transform from the man who used to read me bedtime stories and help me with science projects into someone who could look right through me. Patricia had convinced him I was ungrateful, manipulative, a burden on their new family. By the time I turned 17, he spoke to me only when necessary, and even then, with barely concealed resentment. His tech company, Novatech Solutions, had been struggling for 2 years. What Dad didn't realize was that his financial troubles weren't just due to market forces. Patricia had been slowly embezzling from the company since their marriage, skimming from accounts and covering her tracks by blaming losses on bad investments and economic downturns. She'd been planning his downfall from the beginning, positioning herself to inherit his assets when the company inevitably collapsed. That's when Harold Blackwood approached him with an offer that seemed like salvation. Merge the companies, with Harold's son Marcus as CEO of the combined entity, sealed by a marriage between Marcus and Dad's daughter. The daughter Harold thought was Sophia, but Patricia had been even cleverer than I'd realized in my first life. She'd seen how valuable this arrangement could be and had spent months maneuvering to get her biological daughter positioned as Dad's heir in all public documents. When Harold made his offer, Patricia smiled sweetly and suggested that perhaps the other daughter would be more suitable, the one who was quieter, more traditional, better suited for Marcus's needs. Emma has always been such a thoughtful girl, she'd told Harold during their initial meeting, which I'd overheard from the kitchen where I was serving them coffee. She understands the importance of family loyalty, of putting others' needs before her own. Sophia is wonderful, of course, but she's perhaps too spirited for a traditional marriage arrangement. Emma would be grateful for the opportunity to serve such a distinguished family. Dad had agreed without even consulting me. When he finally told me about the arrangement, it was presented as a fait accompli. "The Blackwoods are a very successful family, Emma," he'd said, not quite meeting my eyes. "This marriage will secure both our futures. You should be grateful for the opportunity." "But I want to go to college," I'd protested. "I have good grades. I could get scholarships." "College is expensive, and frankly, Emma, you're not Sophia." Patricia's voice cut through my hopes like a blade. "Some girls are meant for academic achievement, and others are meant for supporting roles. There's no shame in recognizing your limitations." Dad had nodded along, and I'd realized with crushing finality that he truly believed I was worth nothing more than a business transaction. In my previous life, I'd gone through with it. I'd married Marcus, endured 3 years of escalating psychological and physical abuse, watched helplessly as he stripped my father's company for parts, and left Dad bankrupt anyway. I'd tried to leave twice. The first time, Marcus had convinced Dad I was having a mental breakdown and needed to be brought home for my own safety. The second time, I'd made it as far as a women's shelter before Marcus's private investigators tracked me down. The car accident had been his final solution to the problem of a wife who wouldn't stay broken. But this time, I remembered everything. The hidden accounts where Marcus laundered money, the falsified contracts he used to inflate company values, the network of corrupt officials he bribed to overlook building code violations in his real estate developments. Most crucially, I remembered the FBI investigation that would begin in exactly 3 months, triggered by a whistleblower report from one of Marcus's own accountants. In my previous life, that investigation had come too late to save me. This time, I would make sure it came at exactly the right moment to destroy them all. The decision crystallized as I sat in the Blackwoods marble foyer 2 days before my 18th birthday, listening to Marcus's mother explain the rules of their household. I would be Marcus's wife in name, his property in practice. I would smile, stay quiet, and produce airs when told. My education would end immediately. Marcus didn't believe wives needed college degrees. And anyway, I'd be far too busy managing his household and social calendar. We're very traditional here, Mrs. Blackwood explained, her voice carrying the kind of refined cruelty that only comes with generations of inherited wealth. Marcus's wife will represent our family in the community, which means certain standards must be maintained. You'll work with our personal shopper to develop an appropriate wardrobe, our etiquette coach to refine your social skills, and our dietitian to ensure you maintain an attractive figure. She handed me a leather-bound folder. These are the guidelines for a Blackwood wife. Study them carefully. I flipped through pages detailing everything from acceptable conversation topics at social events to prescribed workout routines. There were rules about when I could speak, what I could eat, who I could befriend, even what books I was allowed to read. It was a manual for creating the perfect trophy wife. Beautiful, compliant, and utterly controllable. What if I have questions? I asked, playing the role of a nervous but eager to please bride-to-be. Marcus laughed from his position by the fireplace. You won't need to ask questions, darling. You'll just need to follow instructions. That night, locked in what they called my room but felt more like a luxurious prison, I began to plan their destruction. First, I needed to understand the full scope of their operation. In my previous life, I'd been too broken and isolated to piece together how extensive their corruption really was, but now I had the advantage of hindsight combined with access to their home systems. The Blackwood mansion was a testament to the kind of wealth that comes from generations of careful criminality. Harold's grandfather had built the family fortune during Prohibition, and each subsequent generation had found new ways to launder money and avoid taxes. By the time Harold took over, they had a network of shell companies spanning 3 countries, real estate holdings worth hundreds of millions, and enough politicians in their pocket to ensure that investigations never went anywhere. Marcus had inherited his father's criminal instincts but lacked his subtlety. Where Harold was content to skim steadily and avoid attention, Marcus wanted to build an empire quickly. He'd expanded into cryptocurrency fraud, international money laundering, and human trafficking, all while maintaining the family's respectable facade through charitable donations and social connections. What they didn't know was that their empire was about to come crashing down and I was going to be the one holding the sledgehammer. Using the computer skills Dad had never bothered to notice I possessed, I began my reconnaissance. The Blackwoods' home network was laughably insecure. They were so confident in their power that they'd never considered the possibility of being infiltrated by someone they considered powerless. Within a week, I had administrative access to every device in the house. The first thing I discovered was that Marcus's cruelty extended far beyond what I'd experienced in my previous life. His computer contained videos of his abuse of previous girlfriends, detailed plans for breaking down my resistance, and communications with other wealthy men who shared his interests in training young wives. He was part of a network of abusers who traded techniques and shared victims. The second thing I found was evidence of Harold's connection to a human trafficking ring that operated through their real estate empire. Young women, mostly immigrants, were housed in Blackwood-owned properties and forced into domestic and sexual slavery. The ledgers showed hundreds of victims over the past decade. The third discovery was the most personally satisfying: detailed records of how they'd planned to destroy my father's company even before the marriage arrangement was finalized. Marcus had been conducting corporate espionage against Novatech for months, stealing trade secrets and client lists to ensure that the merger would leave him in complete control. They'd never intended to honor their agreement. Dad was walking into a trap that would leave him with nothing, but I also discovered something new, something I hadn't known in my previous life. The FBI wasn't just investigating them randomly. Someone had been feeding the Bureau information for months, building a case that would bring down the entire network, digging deeper into Harold's communications. I found the truth. Patricia, my stepmother, had been playing a longer game than anyone realized. She'd married my father not for love or even his money, but because she'd known about his connection to the Blackwoods through business circles. She'd spent 5 years positioning herself to take over his company when it inevitably failed. And when Harold approached with his merger offer, she'd seen the perfect opportunity to eliminate multiple threats to her plans. Patricia had been secretly recording Marcus's confessions about the family business, documenting Harold's criminal activities, and preparing to turn them all into the FBI once the marriage was complete, and she'd gained access to their assets through me. Her plan was elegant. Let me marry into the family, gather inside information about their operations, then destroy them all and claim whistleblower protections that would allow her to keep a significant portion of their recovered assets. The beautiful irony was that she'd underestimated both me and Marcus. She thought I was a weak, broken girl who would be easily controlled and manipulated into serving as her unwitting spy. She didn't realize that Marcus's abuse would escalate to murder or that I'd come back with the knowledge to destroy them all myself. But Patricia's plan gave me something valuable, a timeline. I knew exactly when she planned to contact the FBI, which meant I could move first and control the narrative. Armed with this information, I refined my strategy. Phase 1 began 3 weeks before the wedding. I reached out to Special Agent Sarah Chen, the FBI investigator I remembered from my past life, using an encrypted email account I'd created during carefully planned trips to the local library. My message was simple but compelling. I have information about the Blackwood organization that you need to see. They're planning something big, and people are going to die if you don't act soon. The response came within hours. Agent Chen wanted to meet. Our first meeting took place in a coffee shop 40 miles from town, in a neighboring state where I was less likely to be recognized. I'd told everyone I was going wedding dress shopping with friends from school, a lie that made Patricia smile with cruel satisfaction, since she'd already insisted I wear her old dress, a yellowed monstrosity from the 1980s that had belonged to her grandmother. Agent Chen was exactly as I remembered, sharp-eyed, no nonsense, with an intensity that suggested she'd seen too much corruption to be surprised by anything. But when I laid out what I knew about the Blackwood operation, even she looked stunned. "How did you get access to these records?" she asked, studying the printed emails and financial documents I'd brought. "I'm living in their house," I said simply. "I'm supposed to marry Marcus Blackwood in 3 weeks. They think I'm just a decorative future wife, so they talk business in front of me like I'm furniture." I'd prepared carefully for this meeting, bringing evidence that would be impressive but not reveal the full scope of my knowledge. Bank account numbers for 3 shell companies, dates of recent money transfers, and, most importantly, the location of Harold's private safe where he kept his most incriminating documents. "This is..." Agent Chen shook her head. "Do you understand what you're showing me? This is evidence of a criminal enterprise that spans decades. Money laundering, tax evasion, corruption of public officials, and if what you're telling me about the human trafficking is true, we're talking about federal charges that could put these people away for life." "I understand," I said quietly, "but there's more, and it gets worse." Over the next 2 hours, I gave her everything I could safely reveal without exposing my supernatural knowledge. The cryptocurrency fraud scheme, the network of corrupt building inspectors who allowed Blackwood properties to violate safety codes, the bribes paid to immigration officials who looked the other way when trafficked women disappeared from detention centers. But I also gave her something she hadn't expected: evidence of Patricia's involvement and her plan to betray the Blackwoods after my marriage. "Your stepmother has been gathering intelligence on them for months," I explained, showing her printed screenshots of Patricia's secret communications. "But she's not planning to turn them in until after my marriage gives her legal access to their assets. She's been using me as an unwitting pawn in her own scheme." Agent Chen leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. "What do you want from this? Why are you helping us instead of just running away?" I met her eyes directly. "Because in 3 weeks, they're going to force me to marry a man who's already told me exactly how he plans to hurt me. Because my father sold me to save a business that is already doomed, and he doesn't even know it. Because there are other girls being hurt by these people right now, and I might be the only one who can stop it." I paused, letting the weight of that sink in. "And because I want them all to pay for what they've done." Agent Chen studied my face for a long moment. "You're 18 years old. You should be worried about prom and college applications, not taking down criminal enterprises. Are you sure you understand what you are getting into? I understand that if I don't do this, Marcus Blackwood will spend the next few years systematically destroying me, while his family continues to profit from other people's suffering. I understand that my stepmother will walk away with millions of dollars she's stolen while my father loses everything. And I understand that if I run away now, I'll spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for them to find me. The truth was more complicated than that, but Agent Chen didn't need to know about past lives and second chances. She just needed to know that I was committed to seeing this through. We arranged for a second meeting the following week. I would continue gathering evidence, focusing particularly on the human trafficking operation and the locations where victims were being held. Agent Chen would begin preparing arrest warrants and coordinating with other federal agencies. "One more thing," she said as we prepared to leave. "You mentioned that your stepmother is planning to contact us after your marriage. Do you know when?" "2 weeks after the wedding," I replied. "She wants to make sure she's legally connected to the Blackwood assets before she burns them down." Agent Chen nodded grimly. "Then we need to move faster than that. Can you get me access to Harold's private safe?" I smiled for the first time since entering that coffee shop. "I can do better than that. I can get you the combination." The next phase of my plan required careful timing and even more careful acting. I needed to maintain my cover as the submissive bride-to-be while simultaneously gathering the evidence that would destroy my captors. More importantly, I needed to do it all without alerting Marcus to my true capabilities. Marcus, for his part, was becoming increasingly possessive as the wedding approached. He'd instituted new rules about my daily activities: no leaving the house without supervision, no phone calls without someone listening in, no internet access except under his direct observation. He claimed these restrictions were for my protection, but I could see the excitement in his eyes when he explained them. The control was already beginning, and he was savoring every moment. "We can't have you getting any strange ideas," he'd said, confiscating my phone and replacing it with one that only had his number and his mother's programmed into it. "Some girls get nervous before their wedding and do foolish things. I'm just making sure you stay focused on what's important." What he didn't know was that I'd anticipated this escalation. I'd already established multiple backup communication methods, including a satellite phone hidden in my bedroom and anonymous email accounts accessible from the library computers during my supervised educational outings with Mrs. Blackwood. I'd also taken precautions to document Marcus's growing abuse. The hidden cameras I'd installed in my room captured his increasingly aggressive, private conversations with me, where he detailed exactly what our marriage would entail. The recordings would serve both as evidence for the FBI and as insurance if Marcus tried to claim I was a willing participant in his family's crimes. But the most crucial element of my plan required getting access to Harold's private study, where he kept his most sensitive documents. This was easier said than done. The room was locked, monitored by security cameras, and Harold was extremely paranoid about anyone entering his personal space. My opportunity came during the wedding rehearsal dinner, when all the Blackwoods were focused on impressing their wealthy guests and maintaining their social facade. While Marcus was giving a speech about how blessed he felt to be marrying such a traditional girl, I excused myself to use the restroom and slipped away to Harold's study. The combination to his safe was exactly what I'd expected: his wife's birthday, followed by the year his father died. Criminals, I'd learned, were often remarkably predictable in their sentimentality. Inside the safe, I found treasure trove of incriminating evidence that exceeded even my expectations. Account numbers for offshore banks, contracts with human traffickers, photographs of politicians accepting bribes, and most damning of all, detailed ledgers showing the profits from 20 years of selling women and children. But the document that made my hands shake was a folder labeled Emma Morrison, Acquisition and Training Plan. Inside were psychological profiles analyzing my weaknesses, detailed schedules for breaking down my resistance, and worst of all, a contract with a plastic surgeon who specialized in corrective procedures to make wives more aesthetically pleasing to their husbands. They hadn't just planned to abuse me, they'd planned to physically alter me to suit Marcus's preferences. I photographed everything with the high-resolution camera I'd hidden in my evening clutch, working quickly but methodically to ensure every page was captured clearly. The evidence was overwhelming, enough to put the entire Blackwood family away for life and implicate dozens of their associates in the process. As I carefully returned everything to its original position, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Marcus's voice carried through the door. "Has anyone seen Emma? She's been gone for almost 20 minutes. I closed the safe, erased any evidence of my presence, and slipped out through the study's French doors onto the garden terrace. By the time Marcus found me, I was sitting on a bench, looking appropriately overwhelmed by the magnitude of the next day's ceremony. "There you are," he said, his voice carrying an edge of suspicion. "Mother was worried you might be having second thoughts." I looked up at him with what I hoped appeared to be a nervous excitement. I just needed some air. Everything feels so big, so important. His expression softened slightly, but I could see him filing away my absence for future reference. "It is important, darling. Tomorrow you become part of something much larger than yourself. You should feel honored." "I do," I lied smoothly. "I just want to make sure I'm worthy of the Blackwood name." He smiled then, the expression predatory and satisfied. "Don't worry, I'll make sure you are." That night, I uploaded everything to Agent Chen's secure server and sent a simple message. "Wedding is tomorrow at 3 p.m. Move fast." Her response came within an hour. "Warrants approved, teams in position, stay safe." The morning of my wedding dawned gray and overcast, which felt appropriate for what was supposed to be the worst day of my life, but would actually be the beginning of my enemy's destruction. I played my role perfectly, accepting Patricia's helpful advice about marriage and family duty, while Mrs. Blackwood supervised my preparation like a general organizing a military campaign. "You look beautiful, dear," Patricia said, adjusting the awful vintage dress that smelled of mothballs and broken dreams. "Marcus is such a lucky man." "Thank you," I replied, watching her face in the mirror. Soon she would discover that her carefully laid plans had been shattered by the girl she'd spent 5 years underestimating. The wedding was scheduled for 3 p.m. in the Blackwoods' private chapel, a gaudy monument to their wealth that featured stained glass windows depicting scenes of conquest and domination. The guest list included politicians, business leaders, and socialites, all of whom had been carefully cultivated by the Blackwood family over decades of strategic relationship building. But as the guests began arriving and I prepared to walk down the aisle toward a future of carefully orchestrated abuse, I knew that none of them would ever forget this day for entirely different reasons than they expected. At 2:45 p.m., exactly 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, FBI agents surrounded the Blackwood estate. I was in my bridal suite, putting on the final touches of my makeup, when I heard the helicopters. Mrs. Blackwood burst through the door, her face white with panic. "There are federal agents at the front gate," she gasped. "They have warrants. They're demanding entry." I turned from the mirror, my expression carefully neutral. What could they possibly want? Before she could answer, the sound of battering rams echoed through the house. The FBI wasn't waiting for permission to enter. Within minutes, the mansion was swarming with federal agents. I could hear Harold shouting about harassment and demanding to speak to his lawyers, while Marcus's voice carried a note of panic I'd never heard before as he tried to coordinate some kind of defense. Agent Chen appeared in my doorway, flanked by 2 other agents. "Emma Morrison?" "Yes," I said, rising from my vanity chair in my wedding dress. "I'm Agent Chen, FBI. We need you to come with us for your protection. You're not under arrest, but we have reason to believe you may be in immediate danger." Mrs. Blackwood made a sound of outrage. "This is ridiculous. Emma is perfectly safe here. She's getting married in 10 minutes. Agent Chen ignored her, focusing on me. "Miss Morrison, did you know that your intended husband has been planning to stage your death within 6 months of your marriage after using you to gain access to your father's business assets?" The room went silent. Mrs. Blackwood's face went through several expressions: confusion, denial, and finally, fear. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Marcus would never." "We have recordings," Agent Chen said quietly. "Multiple conversations where he discusses the timeline and method. Miss Morrison, you need to come with us now." I nodded, gathering the small bag I'd packed with essential documents. "I understand." As Agent Chen escorted me from the room, I caught sight of Marcus being led away in handcuffs through the main hallway. Our eyes met for a moment, and I saw the exact instant when he realized that his helpless victim had orchestrated his downfall. The look of pure rage on his face was worth every risk I'd taken. But the best moment came when we reached the main foyer, where Harold was arguing with federal agents, while Patricia stood nearby, clearly trying to position herself as an innocent bystander who'd been deceived by the Blackwood family. "Agent Chen," I said quietly. I believe you'll find Mrs. Morrison very cooperative. She's been gathering evidence against the Blackwoods for months. Patricia's head snapped toward me, her eyes wide with shock. She'd been so careful to hide her own agenda, never imagining that her stepdaughter might have uncovered her plans. I'm sure she'll be able to provide you with extensive documentation about their criminal activities, I continued, assuming, of course, that she's willing to explain how she obtained all that information and why she didn't report it to authorities sooner. Agent Chen smiled grimly. Mrs. Morrison, I think we need to have a conversation about your own role in recent events. You have the right to remain silent. As they read Patricia her rights, I saw her face crumble with the realization that her careful game had been turned against her. She'd thought she was the puppet master, but she'd actually been just another piece on my chessboard. The media coverage of the Blackwood arrest dominated news cycles for weeks. Multi-generational criminal empire exposed. Human trafficking ring busted at society wedding. FBI saves bride from forced marriage to alleged killer. The headlines painted a picture of corruption so extensive that it seemed almost fictional. But while the world focused on the spectacular nature of the arrests, I was quietly putting the final pieces of my revenge plan into motion. My father, who'd learned about the FBI raid from news reports, came to see me at the safe house where I was staying during the initial investigation period. He looked older than his 52 years, his face etched with guilt and confusion. "Emma," he said, sitting across from me in the sterile federal facility, "I don't understand what happened. The agents told me that Marcus was planning to hurt you, that the whole merger was some kind of fraud. How did you know?" I studied this man who'd sold me to save a business that was already doomed, who'd chosen his new wife's comfort over his daughter's well-being, who'd convinced himself that trading me away was an act of paternal wisdom rather than cowardice. "I didn't know," I said carefully. "I just knew something was wrong. The way Marcus talked to me, the things his family said about what marriage would be like. I got scared and reached out to the FBI. It wasn't entirely a lie, just incomplete. Dad didn't need to know about past lives and supernatural knowledge. He just needed to understand the consequences of his choices." "I should have protected you," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have listened when you said you didn't want this marriage. I was so focused on saving the company that I forgot about saving you." "The company can't be saved, Dad," I said gently. "Even if the merger had gone through, they were planning to destroy Novatech and steal everything you'd built. The FBI showed me the documents. You would have lost everything anyway." He buried his face in his hands. "What kind of father does this? What kind of man sells his daughter?" It was a question I'd wanted him to ask for 5 years, but now that he was finally confronting his failures, I found that my anger had transformed into something more complex. I was no longer the powerless girl who'd needed his protection. I was the woman who'd saved herself and brought down the monsters who'd threatened both of us. "The kind of man who was in pain and made terrible decisions," I said finally. "The kind of man who let other people convince him that his daughter was worthless. The kind of man who can still change, if he chooses to." Over the following months, as the legal proceedings against the Blackwoods and Patricia moved forward, I watched Dad struggle with the reality of what he'd almost done to me. The therapy sessions I'd mandated as part of his trust fund conditions were helping, but real change was slow and painful. His letters, which arrived every month like clockwork, showed gradual progress. "Dear Emma, I've been thinking about the night your mother died and how lost I felt. I think I stopped being your father that night and became something else. Someone selfish and weak, who wanted other people to fix his problems instead of facing them. I let Patricia convince me that you were the problem because it was easier than admitting I was failing you. Dear Emma, Dr. Williams asked me to write down my favorite memory of you before your mother died. I wrote about the time you built that robot for the science fair when you were 11, and how proud I felt watching you explain how it worked to the judges. I realized I haven't felt proud of anything you've accomplished since then. Not because you stopped achieving things, but because I stopped paying attention. Dear Emma, I went to your old high school today and asked to see your transcript. Did you know you graduated valedictorian? Did you know you scored in the 99th percentile on your SATs? I never saw any of this because Patricia handled all your school communications, and I never bothered to ask. I've been living with a stranger in my house for 5 years, a brilliant, accomplished stranger who happened to be my daughter. But the most satisfying aspect of my revenge wasn't Dad's slow journey toward redemption. It was watching the systematic destruction of everyone who'd wronged me. Marcus received a federal sentence of 45 years without the possibility of parole. Human trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, tax evasion. The charges were so numerous that even his family's expensive lawyers couldn't negotiate them down significantly. The evidence I'd provided was overwhelming and irrefutable. Harold got life in prison without parole. The FBI's investigation had uncovered evidence of his involvement in the murders of 3 witnesses who'd threatened to expose the family's operations over the years. The human trafficking alone would have destroyed him, but the murder charges ensured he'd never see freedom again. Mrs. Blackwood, despite her claims of ignorance, received 25 years for conspiracy and money laundering. The financial records showed she'd been actively involved in managing the family's illegal assets for decades. But Patricia's fate was perhaps the most poetic. She'd been so clever in her planning, so careful in her documentation of the Blackwoods' crimes, that she'd created an extensive paper trail of her own criminal knowledge. The FBI didn't buy her claims that she'd been planning to report everything after my marriage. Her communications showed she'd been planning to profit from the information, not expose it for the public good. She received 15 years for conspiracy, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. More importantly, the federal seizure of all assets connected to her crimes left her completely bankrupt. The house, the cars, the jewelry, the art collection, everything purchased with stolen money was confiscated and sold at auction. Sophia, who'd been living off stolen money without fully understanding its source, suddenly found herself facing her own fraud charges for the fake transcripts Patricia had bought her. Her college degree was revoked, her job applications were rejected due to her criminal record, and the wealthy lifestyle she'd taken for granted disappeared overnight. The irony was perfect. The girl who'd been handed everything while I got nothing was now left with less than nothing, while I was being courted by universities across the country. Because that was the other part of my plan that I hadn't shared with anyone. Not Agent Chen, not Dad, not even myself until it started happening. While everyone else was dealing with FBI investigations, court dates, and federal prosecutors, I'd been quietly applying to universities using the academic record I'd earned while doing Sophia's homework and maintaining my own secret studies. MIT, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, Harvard, schools that had once seemed impossible were suddenly sending acceptance letters. The full scholarship to MIT came with a personal note from the dean of admissions that made me smile for days. Miss Morrison, your application materials demonstrate not only exceptional academic achievement, but also remarkable resilience and moral courage. Your essay about exposing corruption in the face of personal danger shows exactly the kind of character we seek in our students. We look forward to supporting you. The full scholarship to MIT came with a personal note from the dean of admissions that made me smile for days. Miss Morrison, your application materials demonstrate not only exceptional academic achievement, but also remarkable resilience and moral courage. Your essay about exposing corruption in the face of personal danger shows exactly the kind of character we seek in our students. We look forward to supporting your continued academic excellence. What they didn't know was that my essay about exposing corruption had been carefully crafted to tell just enough of the truth to be compelling without revealing the supernatural elements of my story. I'd written about recognizing the warning signs of an abusive situation, about finding the courage to contact law enforcement, about the importance of protecting other vulnerable people. It was all true, just incomplete. The scholarship covered everything: tuition, room and board, books, even a generous stipend for living expenses. More importantly, it came with access to MIT's advanced computer science programs and research opportunities that would set me up for the kind of career I'd only dreamed of in my previous life. Dad was confused when I announced my plans to leave for college in the fall. "Emma, sweetheart, maybe you should wait a year," he said, sitting in the modest apartment he'd rented after losing the house. "With everything that's happened, with the trials coming up, maybe we should stick together as a family. Try to rebuild what we had." I looked at this man who'd sold me to save a business he'd already lost, who'd chosen his new wife's daughter over his own for 5 years, who'd stood by and watched me be treated like a servant in my own home. The man who is now asking me to delay my dreams again, to sacrifice my future again, to put his needs before my own again. We're not a family, Dad, I said calmly. You made that clear when you signed that contract. But don't worry, I'll make sure you're taken care of. And I did keep that promise in my own way. Before leaving for MIT, I established a trust fund that would provide him with exactly enough money to live modestly. A small apartment, basic groceries, reliable transportation. But the money came with conditions that would ensure he never forgot the lessons he needed to learn. He had to attend therapy sessions twice a week to address his grief over Mom's death and his failures as a parent. He had to perform community service at a domestic violence shelter, helping other families affected by abuse and manipulation. He had to take parenting classes, even though his only child was now an adult, so he could understand what he'd done wrong. Most importantly, he had to write me letters every month, acknowledging what he'd done wrong and what he was doing to change. Not apologies. I was tired of meaningless apologies. I wanted accountability, growth, and evidence that he was becoming a different person. The letters started arriving 6 weeks into my freshman year. Dear Emma, the first one began. Dr. Williams says I need to stop making excuses and start taking responsibility for my actions. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm starting to understand how badly I failed you. The therapist says I used Patricia and Sophia to avoid dealing with my grief over your mother's death, and that I let them convince me you were the problem instead of facing my own issues. I was supposed to protect you, and instead I put you in danger. I was supposed to love you unconditionally, and instead I made you earn basic respect in your own home. I don't know if I can ever make up for what I did, but I want to try to become the father you deserve to have. They got better over time, more honest, more painful, more real. By my sophomore year, he was writing things like, I volunteered at the shelter yesterday, and I met a girl about your age whose stepfather had been abusing her for years while her mother looked the other way. When she told me her story, I realized I was looking at what could have happened to you if you hadn't been strong enough to save yourself. I realized that I was the kind of father that other counselors warn about, the kind who prioritizes his own comfort over his child's safety, the kind who fails when it matters most. By my junior year, I realized yesterday that I don't even know what your favorite color is, or what you want to study, or whether you're happy. I spent 5 years looking right through you, and I can't forgive myself for that. I keep thinking about all the conversations we never had, all the achievements I never celebrated, all the times you needed me and I wasn't there. Dr. Williams says healing takes time, but I'm starting to think some damage can't be undone, only learned from. The letters were therapeutic for both of us, I think. They forced him to confront his failures honestly, and they showed me that he was genuinely trying to change. I never wrote back. I wasn't ready for that level of reconciliation and might never be. But I read every word and kept them all in a file folder that grew thicker each month. Meanwhile, I was building the life I'd always dreamed of. MIT was everything I'd hoped and more. My professors quickly recognized my unusual combination of technical skills and real-world experience with criminal justice, and I found myself being invited to participate in advanced research projects, usually reserved for graduate students. My sophomore year, I was recruited for a special program that partnered computer science students with federal law enforcement agencies to develop new tools for investigating cybercrime. The program director, Dr. Sarah Martinez, had read about my role in exposing the Blackwood organization and specifically requested me for her team. Emma, she said during our first meeting, your background gives you insights that most academic researchers lack. You understand how criminal organizations actually operate, not just how we think they operate. That's invaluable for developing effective countermeasures. The irony was perfect. My knowledge of criminal operations, gained through supernatural means, was being channeled into legitimate research that would help law enforcement agencies protect other victims. My junior year brought an opportunity that seemed almost too good to be true. Dr. Martinez called me into her office with an expression I couldn't read. Emma, she said, I've been reviewing your work on cryptocurrency security protocols, and I have to ask, have you been in contact with any federal investigators about this research? My heart stopped. Had they somehow connected me to information I shouldn't have had access to? Why do you ask? Because the FBI just called. Apparently, your research has directly led to the identification and prevention of a major international money laundering operation. They want to recruit you for a summer internship with their financial crimes division. She leaned forward. Emma, what you've discovered could revolutionize how we handle digital financial crimes. They're saying your work is groundbreaking. I thought about Marcus, sitting in federal prison, probably wondering how his perfect crime had been unraveled by a girl he'd dismissed as weak and stupid. I thought about Patricia, who'd believed she was the smartest person in any room. I thought about Dad, who'd seen me as nothing more than a bargaining chip. When do they want me to start? I asked. The FBI internship was a dream come true. I was assigned to a team investigating cryptocurrency fraud, exactly the kind of crimes the Blackwoods had specialized in. My supervisor, Agent Rodriguez, had worked on the original Blackwood case and recognized my name immediately. You're the girl who brought down Harold Blackwood, he said on my first day. That took incredible courage. It took incredible anger, I replied honestly. Courage came later. The internship led to a full-time job offer before I'd even graduated. By 21, I was working as a financial crimes analyst, using my unique combination of technical skills and criminal psychology knowledge to investigate cases that stumped other agents. By 23, I'd been promoted twice and was earning more money than Dad had ever made at Novatech. But the most satisfying moment of my professional life came during my second year with the Bureau, when I was assigned to investigate a case that seemed familiar. A wealthy family using real estate investments to launder money from human trafficking operations. The Ashford family had been operating for decades, using almost identical methods to what the Blackwoods had employed. They owned dozens of properties where trafficked women were housed. They bribed local officials to overlook building code violations, and they had a network of shell companies to hide their profits. What made the case personal was the discovery that the Ashfords had been business partners with the Blackwoods for over 20 years. They'd learned from Harold's example and had spent the years since his arrest expanding their operations and recruiting new wealthy families to join their network. This is bigger than we initially thought, Agent Rodriguez told me as we reviewed the evidence. The Blackwood arrest disrupted their operations temporarily, but they've rebuilt and expanded. We're looking at a network that spans multiple states and involves dozens of wealthy families. I studied the organizational charts we'd created, mapping the connections between various criminal enterprises. They learned from the Blackwoods' mistakes. They're more compartmentalized now, harder to investigate comprehensively. Exactly. Which is why we need someone who understands how these families think, how they operate, how they make themselves vulnerable. He looked at me directly. Someone who's been inside their world. The investigation took 18 months and involved coordination with law enforcement agencies across 3 countries. But when we finally moved, the results were spectacular. 47 arrests, including 12 members of prominent society families, the rescue of over 200 trafficking victims, and the seizure of assets worth nearly $1 billion. The media called it the largest human trafficking bust in federal history. I called it unfinished business. But the real ending to my story came on my 25th birthday, the age I'd been when Marcus murdered me in my previous life. I was celebrating at a small restaurant in Georgetown with colleagues from the Bureau when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. Emma? The voice was weak, uncertain, but familiar. Dad? I hope it's okay that I called. I know you asked me not to, but today is your birthday, and His voice broke. 25 years ago today, you came into the world and made me the happiest man alive. I want you to know that I remember that feeling, even though I forgot it for too many years. I stepped outside the restaurant, needing privacy for this conversation. How did you get this number? I hired a private investigator, he admitted. Not to bother you or find out where you live, just to make sure you were okay. He told me you work for the FBI now, that you're doing important work. I'm so proud of you, Emma. I know I don't have the right to be proud, but I am. I stood on the sidewalk watching traffic pass by, thinking about the girl who'd once sat in a marble foyer being told the rules of her captivity. That girl was gone, replaced by someone who made the rules instead of following them. The private investigator, I said finally. What else did he tell you? That you're happy, that you have friends, colleagues who respect you, work that matters to you, that you built a good life despite everything I put you through. He paused. That's all I wanted to know. That you're okay. I'm more than okay, Dad. I'm exactly who I was meant to be. I know, he said quietly. And I know that's not because of anything I did to help you. It's because of who you are, despite everything I did to hurt you. We talked for 20 minutes, the longest conversation we'd had since I left for college. He told me about his volunteer work at the shelter, about the families he was helping, about the parenting classes that had taught him what he should have known years earlier. I told him about my work, about the cases I was solving, about the people I was helping. When we hung up, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of peace. He would never be the father I'd needed him to be when I was 17 and terrified. But he was becoming a better person, and that mattered for the other families he encountered in his volunteer work. The business deal Dad had made cost him everything, just as I'd promised it would. But in losing everything, I had gained everything that truly mattered. The freedom to choose my own path, the strength to protect other victims, and the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. Marcus was still in federal prison, where his arrogance and history of violence against women had made him extremely unpopular with other inmates. Harold had died in prison 2 years earlier, officially from a heart attack, though rumors suggested that inmates had their own ways of dealing with child traffickers. Patricia had been released after serving her full sentence, only to discover that her reputation and criminal record made rebuilding her life nearly impossible. Sophia was working as a waitress in a small town 3 states away, still struggling with the consequences of a life built on lies and stolen opportunities. She'd reached out to me once through social media, sending a message that said simply, "I know you probably hate me, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I didn't understand what Patricia was doing to you, but I should have. I'm trying to be better now." I'd never responded. Some apologies come too late to matter, and some bridges burn too completely to rebuild. But I hoped she was learning the same lessons Dad was learning. That real change requires acknowledging the full scope of your failures and working every day to become someone different. As for me, I continued working for the Bureau for 5 more years, building a reputation as one of the most effective financial crimes investigators in the country. I specialized in cases involving family-based criminal enterprises, using my unique insights to understand how corruption spreads through generations and how it can be stopped. Eventually, I was recruited by a private consulting firm that worked with international law enforcement agencies to investigate transnational organized crime. The work took me around the world, dismantling networks that profited from human suffering and bringing justice to victims who'd never thought they'd see their abusers face consequences. I never married, though I had relationships with good men who respected my independence and understood my commitment to my work. I never wanted children, having seen too clearly how parents could fail their most basic responsibilities. I built a life centered around protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, and it was more fulfilling than any traditional path could have been. On quiet evenings in my Georgetown townhouse, I sometimes thought about the girl who'd sat in that marble foyer being told the rules of her captivity. She'd been powerless, terrified, convinced that her life was over before it had really begun. She couldn't have imagined that her worst nightmare would become the foundation for her greatest triumph. The Blackwoods had wanted to trade me like property, to break me down and rebuild me according to their specifications. Instead, they'd given me the knowledge and motivation I needed to become someone far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. A woman who understood exactly how predators operated and who'd dedicated her life to stopping them. Every case I solved, every victim I helped, every criminal I put behind bars was a continuation of my revenge against everyone who'd tried to convince me I was worthless. The business deal Dad made to save his company had cost him everything: his marriage, his money, his relationship with his daughter, his self-respect. But it had also freed me to become exactly who I was meant to be. Not the submissive wife Marcus had planned to create, not the grateful stepdaughter Patricia had wanted to exploit, not the burden Dad had tried to trade away, but a woman who made her own rules and lived by her own terms. In the end, that was the most perfect revenge of all, transforming their attempt to destroy me into the catalyst for my own triumph. They'd wanted to erase Emma Morrison and create someone else entirely. Instead, they'd forged the real Emma Morrison, stronger, smarter, and more dangerous than any of them had ever dreamed possible. And every morning when I woke up in my own home, reviewing cases involving people who thought they were too powerful to face consequences, I remembered the promise I'd made to myself in that marble foyer. They would all pay for what they'd done. Mission accomplished.